Today we begin our Unraveled summer worship series. 12 weeks with 12 texts from the Bible that explore times when people's lives become unraveled. It's not hard to imagine what life is like when it becomes unraveled right now, is it? Just look around at where we are today. We are not gathered in person as we worship. Plans have fallen apart. Our nation is full of unjust and unrest. And life feels a bit like these individual tattered pieces of cloth that are on our communion table. These stories that we will be journeying with over the next 12 weeks contain the whole spectrum of human emotion, from the depths of despair and grief to the euphoria of joy and laughter, and everything else in between. These stories are our stories. The truth we will find in them reflects the truth of our own messy lives, in our own messy times. Unraveling happens in many ways. Sometimes we are unraveled by external forces like a pandemic. Sometimes we are unraveled by violence and injustice. Sometimes we unravel ourselves, and sometimes we allow ourselves to become unraveled by what we have done or by what we have left undone. And sometimes God is the great unraveler. I wrestled with keeping these stories in the order that a sanctified art presents them in the journal pages that you will receive in your emails. Because the series starts with a place of surprise, joy, and laughter. And I don't know about you, but it is hard to think about all that is wrong in our nation and our world today, all the places where people find despair and disagree. It's hard to think about finding places of joy. But I was listening to Kate Bowler's podcast last week called Everything Happens. Kate is a professor at Duke University who hosts a podcast that spun out from her book, Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lives I've Loved. In her podcast from May 26th, she speaks to Gary Hugin, founder and CEO of International Justice Mission, who says even in the darkest of places, joy and goodness can be found. He says it's impossible to do the work of justice and compassion without attending to the care of one's soul. He says joy is the oxygen for doing hard things in the world. I want you to hear that again. Joy is the oxygen for doing hard things in the world. And so today, let us look at the story of Abraham and Sarah and be reminded that joy is needed in this messy, hard, unraveled world. According to Genesis, God had chosen Sarah and Abraham to be the parents of God's people. God had promised their offspring would outnumber the stars in the sky. There was one problem. Decades had passed and no children had come their way. But God shows up in our text in the form of 3 visitors in the heat of the midday. Abraham is sitting in the shade at the opening of his tent while Sarah is inside. And according to nomadic custom, Abraham welcomes the strangers, offers hospitality and asks Sarah to prepare a meal. "By the way, where is Sarah?" one of the strangers asked. He knows her name, which may be the place in this story when Abraham realizes he is in the presence of God. The man continues and says, "I will return in a year, and when I do, you will have a baby." Sarah is inside the tent preparing the food and listening in. And when the stranger gets to this point, the part about her having the baby, she can't contain herself. She laughs, and she laughs out loud at the absurdity of it all. The stranger, God, hears the laughter and asks, "Why is Sarah laughing? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" Sarah, embarrassed, a little afraid now, says, "I didn't laugh." "Oh, yes, you did," says the stranger. "I heard you laugh." Fast forward to chapter 21. Sarah has conceived a child and has a son. They name him Isaac, which means laughter. And Sarah laughs again, but it's a different laugh now. This time it is laughter at the surprising, unpredictable, unlikely grace of God. She says, "God has brought laughter for me." One of my seminary professors, Walter Brueggemann, says this is the elemental Bible story, because it is about the elemental Judeo-Christian notion of God. God is not an abstraction, not a remote power off somewhere in the sky, but God is a presence, a God who shows up in the barren lives of two old people, shows up with the promise of life and hope. The overwhelming and always relevant question here is anything too wonderful for the Lord? That question is at the heart of what it means for us to have faith. If the answer to that question is yes, some things are difficult for God, then God is not God, and we have decided to live in a closed universe where everything is stable, reliable, and hopeless, and where the end of every story is death. But if we answer no, nothing is too wonderful for God, nothing is too impossible for God, you have taken the leap of faith and decided to live in a world full of possibility, hopefulness, a world full of life, a world full of joy and surprises. The story of Abraham and Sarah is a story of two people, parents of us all, moving from hopelessness to hope, from despair and resignation to possibility, from barrenness to productivity, from death to life. And that's the kind of story that we need right now. The Bible is full of these stories from beginning to end. An old couple having a child, the old promise renew, joy showing up, light coming into the darkness. A God who time and time again comes to his people when they have given up, when they have concluded that God has forgotten them. A God who comes particularly when our backs are up against the wall and our hearts are full of fear. A God who comes quietly, steadily to be with them, Abraham and Sarah, but to be also with us, to bind up our wounds, to weave us back together, to strengthen us for the journey that is difficult, messy, and hard, when things have become unraveled. When life and plans don't happen as we had hoped, when injustice stares us straight in the face, maybe the joy can be found knowing that God's ability to do a new thing is stronger than whatever is causing us to unravel. I wonder, when you think of the story of Abraham and Sarah, when you think of ways in which you have been unraveled, when you search in those places of darkness and despair, where do you find joy? Where have you been unraveled by unexpected joy and surprise? When and where has joy become your oxygen for the journey? And how are we called to bring that joy? How are we called to bring that joy to a world that is hurting, tattered, and unraveled? Come, God, the great weaver, and bind us back together. In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen.